From the beginning of civilization, there has been an insatiable need for the living to make peace and closure with their loved ones that have passed. From the amazing tales of ancient Greeks to the biblical story of the Witch of Endor to the modern day movement starting with the Fox sisters in the 1800s, mediumship has been met with controversy with the famous challenge of the famed magician Harry Houdini. But with the frauds, there have been the unexplained miracles that heal us. Tapping into the living and the dead's communication frequencies is a gift that we may never understand. Scientifically, we approach this by knowing that we only use 10 to 35% at most of our brain function. Mediums are able to tap into what is referred to as theta wave brain function, the falling asleep and just waking up feeling, or the crossing over the veil to communication. In the end, whether you believe or don't believe in this paranormal phenomenon of mediumship, all that matters is the person receiving the message from the gifted gets the closure and peace that we have wanted since the beginning of civilization. Just believe. Thank you to Let's Find Out with Diego, and you could follow me on Facebook under Thomas Patrick Gormley, and on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube as the Archangel of the Paranormal.
Are you curious about the unknown, the unexplainable? Do you find yourself intrigued by the mysterious and paranormal side of our world? Join us on an adventure into the world of inexplicable discoveries and investigations that may someday give us the final answer as to what may be behind the veil of reality. The borders of space and time have opened once again, and transmitting from the mountains of West Virginia, it's time once again for Let's Find Out with Diego. The universe is waiting for you.
The borders of space and time have opened once again and transmitting from the mountains of West Virginia. It's another episode of Let's Find Out with Diego. Thank you for taking this journey with me. On this episode of Let's Find Out, tonight's guest is the founder of Forever Family Foundation, author of the books The Medium Explosion and My Life Here and There. He's currently featured in the Netflix Docuseries Surviving Death, and he's also the host of Signs of Life radio show. We're going to be exploring the evidence of an afterlife, deathbed visions, after-death communications, and as always, all this plus more. Please welcome to Let's Find Out author and radio host Robert Ginsburg. Robert, my friend, welcome to Let's Find Out. It's a pleasure having you on tonight.
Thanks. It's my pleasure to be with you, Diego. Look forward to speaking.
Absolutely. And as I went on and started reading your bio, I honestly didn't even know where to start because there's so much in there, so much great things. So if you don't mind, let's start here. You've been investigating the subject of life after death and mediumship since about 2003. If I may ask, because sometimes these questions can get a little loaded, and what placed you on this path, on this journey?
Well, if we were having this conversation 22 years ago, it would be quite different because I didn't believe, in life after death. I didn't believe in anything that we couldn't perceive with our physical senses. I mean, I was a rational left brain thinker, at least I thought I was. And, the notion that we went somewhere after we died to me was like a fairy tale or wishful thinking, because to me, we were our brains are no more, so we're no more, And I think myself, probably a lot of people can relate to it. I lived a good part of my life in fear of death, like how could we possibly be extinguished forever, and I think that affects a lot of people. My life took a turn, very often personal tragedy or trauma as a catalyst for exploration. My son and my daughter were involved in a car accident. My daughter didn't survive, and my son had some very severe injuries. But the thing was that the morning that of the accident, my wife shot up in bed at 3 o'clock in the morning, and she was shaking and she was trembling. And so, what's the matter? And she just stared, and she wouldn't answer me. I said, "What's the matter?" And she said, "Something horrible is going to happen today." And I said, "Well, what does that mean? Can you tell me more?" And she said, "All I could tell you is that our lives are going to be changed forever." And then, I had, 3 children, so I did what most parents would do. I took her seriously because she was intuitive, and she had, we were together for many, many, many years, and there were periods where she had these so-called visions of things, or precognitive moments, and every time she told me about one, they always play it out exactly the way she said they would, but they were always good things. And so logic told me if she was right then, I mean, she could be right now. Make a long story short, I checked on my 3 kids throughout the day. I let my guard down at night. We all went out to dinner. We had 2 cars, and my kids took 1 car home, and that's when it happened. So that's what happened. Is I spent, after it was clear that my son was going to survive his injuries, which was about a month later because he was in a coma. I suddenly remembered, I emerged from the state of shock I was in, and like, how did my wife know? Because she knew, and that I became consumed with finding out how she knew and whether there was any credible evidence that people could do this. And I traveled across the United States meeting with scientists and medical doctors and researchers that studied the mind and consciousness to find out what evidence I could learn. And so that's a long-winded answer to your question. That's what triggered my exploration.
No, it's unfortunately on how your path started. And prior to before the accident, if you don't mind me asking, were there any kind of stories that your wife would tell you about these experiences? And because it happened shortly before the accident, but years prior to that, anything come to mind?
Yeah, there were things that she would tell me, and I didn't know how she did it. I mean, for example, once went to a charity auction, and a lot of major companies were giving out, raffle, prizes, and you would buy raffle tickets, and this was 35 years ago, and they were very expensive tickets, and I bought a bunch. And we got to the event, and for those people who didn't have a chance to buy tickets, they had them all, the physical tickets lined up on a table. And I felt my wife grab my arm, and she walked me over to the table, and she said, "Buy that ticket." And and then I said, "Why? I already spent a lot of money on tickets. Why should I buy another one?" She said, "Because you're going to buy that ticket, and in 5 minutes, Lufthansa, who was one of the sponsors, is going to be handing us a big, one of those big placards, because with 2 first class, tickets to Germany." And so I even though I really didn't believe in this stuff, I said, "Oh, okay, I'll do it." And then 5 minutes later, we were up on the stage, just as she said, getting the prize. So there were things like that. As I mentioned, they were all good things. And some people have the ability to get a glimpse of a future event. Of course, when you talk about future events, I mean, the future is not etched in stone. There's many forks in the road, and free will plays a big part of it. But in this case, as with many other things that she had visions of, they came true. I think that we all have some degree of intuitive ability. I mean, I don't have my intuitive ability is kind of negligible. Other people that I know are extremely gifted in that regard. And then, of course, we're very much involved in, you mentioned one of my books, The Medium Explosion, where I delve into the world of mediumship. And there I state in the book that, in my opinion, in my own research and my observations, that 85 to 90% of the mediums in practice today cannot do what they claim. Mediums being people who are able to communicate with discarnates, people who are no longer in the physical world. But there are 10 to 15% of them that can, and the evidence that they can provide is incredible. And we developed a certification process by which we evaluate the evidence that they bring forth. And for every 10 mediums that we'll evaluate, we're lucky if we find one. So there are people, mediumship is one form of evidence that we're more than our physical bodies. There are other things that you touched upon in the introduction. There's near-death experiences, after-death communications, end-of-life experiences, reincarnation, all sorts of things, and the evidence is robust and quite abundant.
And it's very interesting because I wasn't bringing this subject up a little bit later in the episode, but we're going to dive into it right now with the certification process that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Are there any? So if you have a sheet, if you're tracking something, what are the characteristics that you're looking for, and what has to match up in order for it to be seen to be a legit person?
Well, yeah. First of all, we don't solicit any medium to come to us because we have to protect the integrity of the program. I mean, we don't charge for it and so forth. And we train sitters being people who are getting readings. We train them about what mediumship is like what constitutes evidence as opposed to general bullshit, and so they go through extensive training. In the process itself, the mediums do 5 different readings for 5 different sitters. We take steps to make sure that the medium does not know the sitter and the sitter does not know the medium. And then the sitters score the pieces of information that they receive from the medium, which is supposedly coming from somebody that, no longer in the physical. The more specific the evidence is, the more weight it's given in the scoring. So if you're the medium, Diego, and I'm the sitter, and you see me, and you can guess about how old I am, and you say to me, Bob, I have your great-grandmother here in spirit. Is your great-grandmother in spirit? Well, I'd have to mark that as a hit, but bearing in mind that she'd be 130 and the oldest person living on Earth, it's a pretty good bet, right? But if you said to me, Diego, I have your grandmother Rebecca here, and she was a school teacher, and you give me all this evidence, you'd agree that should be given more weight than a general piece of of information that could apply to a great many people. What we find, we developed this program as a resource for the bereaved, people that want to get a reading with a qualified medium. The problem that we have, because we've been doing it so long, is that, and the list is so short, that a lot of the mediums that we certified over the years have become famous. And when a medium becomes famous, what happens? They do fewer readings. They have waiting lists that are years long. They charge ridiculous amounts of money. So it kind of defeats the purpose. So we're always trying to identify other people that can do this. And mediumship can, it's like a double-edged sword. We have seen over the years people have their lives completely changed by getting a really strong evidential reading, and has really positive effects on their grief. On the other hand, if you're on the fence and you don't really know if you believe this in afterlife or not, and you go to a medium and you get a real crappy non-evidential reading, you might walk away in worse shape than when you came. So mediums have a great responsibility, and it's something that we take very seriously.
Yeah, and there was a point, I think in the 90s, early 2000s, where the mediumship was at its height. And I think now, kind of the same way, but talking about people who got famous, I think that there were some in the mid to late 90s that were becoming famous. And I think that they became so big that they were selling out these shows, like you said, charging exorbitant prices, and then later down the road, as you start dissecting it, it was kind of like an act where they can just say a lot of things, pick up on your body's reaction, and then it gets their way into making the person getting that information feel better.
Yeah, it's really what you're describing as cold reading techniques. They pick up visual and audio cues from the sitter and make certain assumptions, and then or repeat the same things. But it's something that credible mediums would never resort to. But I've seen a lot of fraudulent mediums over the years that do resort to things like that. I also have you mentioned some of these mediums playing, for huge crowds, and some of them are legitimate gifted mediums, but I have a real problem with playing, at a large arena, let's say with 5,000 people there, charging, let's say, $100 a person. And, you have 5,000 people going to that event, thinking that somehow their loved one's going to come through, and the medium's going to do maybe 7 or 8 readings for the evening, and with 5,000 people, the odds are not too good that you're going to get a
not
reading.
so much.
Yeah, so then mediumship, once it becomes a business, I have a real problem with that. It's not to say that mediums aren't entitled to charge for the work that they do. They have families, they have homes, they have mortgages, they have to support, but there's a reasonable amount of money, that you can charge.
Yeah, and I guess, and to be honest and fair, it's not only with the mediums. I'm going to say in most of the decade of the 80s and early 90s, the whole scene of with televangelists is almost the same thing, to where they're drawing these large crowds and doing these acts of faith healing that depending on how you believe, yeah, some of them can be legit, but I think that a lot of it wound up being an act, and I think a lot of people got duped of their cash as well. But it happens in, I guess, in any discipline of that type of thing,
Yeah, and when it comes to mediums, are not grief counselors or not grief professionals. However, they're working with people that are in very fragile states of mind. And mediumship, there are no regulatory bodies, there are no licensing requirements, and no ethical guidelines. There's no continuing education. There are no proficiency, standards. So, you can open up a shingle business tomorrow, Diego the medium, and start charging people, $300-$400 for a reading, yeah, and you're in business. So it's, it's a problem, and we try to lend some credibility to those that really can do, what they claim. And you mentioned the popularity of mediums. It's nothing new. Back in the starting in the late 1800s and through the Victorian era, mediumship was huge all over the world. I mean, there were no forms of entertainment. Obviously, there was no internet and so forth. So people had these seances where they'd have gatherings and so forth, and became centers of gatherings and entertainment. But just as there are today, there are mediums that could do what they claim, and some that could not, and then some that were just completely fraudulent.
It's awesome that you mentioned that, because the first thing I thought about when you talked about back in those days is Harry Houdini, because back in those times, one of his sole purposes was to try to prove that these people were just an act, that they're just basically taking advantage of people just for their money. And I think Houdini was one of those, definitely, that was going out there trying to disprove the mediumships, at least the ones that were doing it for profit of sorts,
Yeah. Yeah, that's true, and there's still a lot of high profile, skeptics and debunkers today. That there's a difference between being an open minded skeptic and a closed minded skeptic. The closed minded skeptic will not acknowledge the evidence at all. There was a famous scientist that once said that I wouldn't believe this stuff even if it was true. I mean, that's not very scientific, But I think it's important for us all to be open-minded about these things, and just evaluate the evidence and then come to your own conclusions.
Yeah, and it doesn't hurt to be a healthy skeptic, but for those that, the experiences I've had, even when I see things, I'm like, no, it's gonna have to pass some sort of smell test for me, and then I'll delve into it. And as you were going on this journey and doing your research, were you surprised of the amount of people or stories that were coming out as you were going out there interviewing people of life after death and then coming back and giving you these stories of what happened to them once they passed?
Yeah, it's incredible. After death communications is a very broad term, and it takes all forms. Some people call them signs and synchronicities. There are dream visitations. When you're in this certain stages of sleep, when your mind is set aside, that if you're in the non-physical world, you're an entity of consciousness or thought, and you can still communicate with someone in the physical world. It's still a telepathic process. It's still mind-to-mind communication, except that one of the parties, the person in spirit, no longer has a body, but they still have a mind. And when I say they have a mind, you could use the term mind or consciousness or soul. I think they're interchangeable, but that's what continues when we talk about survival of consciousness. That is what survives, physical death. So, yeah, I think that after death, the stories that people have told us over the past 20 years are mind-boggling. Now, scientists will say that this is anecdotal evidence because there's stories, but when you have millions upon millions of people from all diverse corners of the world talking about the same type of communications and phenomena that occur, you have to pay attention to it because then it becomes evidential. It's not one or two people. We used to run these discussion groups for people just to have a safe environment where they could discuss these things without the fear of being labeled or judged. And people would come to a meeting and they wouldn't say a word and they would just listen. And maybe they come to a second meeting and the same thing, they still would not say a word. All of a sudden, the third meeting they'd come to, and they start telling stories about communications. And you just want to shake them and say, why are you holding that in? I'll tell you a quick story you'd probably appreciate.
Yes, please.
2 years after my daughter passed, I went to my doctor, who happened to be a family friend. I don't remember what, I had some ailment. I forget what it was. And I hadn't seen him in a while. So he said, Bob, how you doing? I said, he says, what have you been up to? I said, well, if you really want to know, I've been studying survival of consciousness. And he said, oh, okay. And then we talked for another 5 minutes. He says, let me ask you something. I said, what? He said, what's survival of consciousness? And I explained to him, some of the things that we're talking about. And then we talk some more. His nurse comes in. She's interested in this. We talk some more. She leaves. He closes the door and he gets very serious. And he said, I have to tell you something. I said, what? He said, my father died 8 years ago. I said, well, I'm sorry. And he said, well, I had a lot of critical patients in the hospital. And I had to call my answering service, that morning. And I called the answering service and they said, oh, doctor, your father called. And he said, my father died at 9:00 this morning. And they said, oh, I'm so sorry, doctor. We must have gotten the message wrong. He must have said your father-in-law. He said, my father-in-law has been dead for 16 years. He said, what time did the message come in? They said 9:15. He said, read me back the message. Message was, Frank, it's me. I'm okay.
Wow.
Now, the reason I tell you that is that here's a medical doctor. In the 8 years, he had never told a soul about this. He didn't tell his wife, he didn't tell his kids, didn't tell his family, certainly didn't tell a colleague, but I presented a safe environment because after he heard the stuff I was talking about, he knew I wasn't going to judge him. And now it's been another 15 years, and I guarantee you, he still hasn't told another soul about this. And so it's a shame that what we try to do is encourage people just to talk about the experiences that they have. Because if everybody starts sharing these things, it becomes more mainstream, and not taboo. So we never try to convince anybody. We just encourage them to share what they know.
And it's interesting because if we're going to look to all your years of experience doing this research and investigations, I'm going to ask this question, and excuse me if I flub the question, and sometimes I don't make sense even to myself. During which point does a person have these experiences? And let me ask it like this: is this after they're clinically pronounced dead? Is this happening as they're dying? They have these visions, or is it once they? I'll use the term flatline, and I guess step into the other side.
Well, yeah, I think what you're specifically talking about is a near-death experience. So what happens in a near-death experience is that the patient or the person meets every definition that medical science has for death. They have no brain waves, they have no aspiration, they have no heartbeat, they have no reflexes. Um, Medical doctors and science says that they're dead. And yet, for the ones that get resuscitated, and more people today with all the equipment do get resuscitated, they describe clear and lucid thinking. Now, if you don't have any brain waves, when your brain is dead, I mean, how would you have clear and lucid experiences? And they describe certain things. Not everybody has the same experiences, but there are a lot of commonalities. For instance, you've probably heard about people saying they go through a tunnel, towards a light.
Right.
People see deceased loved ones that are there to greet them. There's this all-encompassing feeling, of love and acceptance. They leave their bodies. You've probably heard the stories where they're in an operating room, they're floating above their bodies, and when they come back, they can tell you every single thing that went on in the operating room and things that were said. There are cases of people that get resuscitated that are blind. They've been sightless since birth. And then when they can see when they're out of their body, and they can describe everything that they saw. So, it's good evidence that our minds can act independently of our physical brains. So if you believe that, then surviving death is not that improbable, because the brain's no more, but our mind still is, consider, not only does it still exist, but the evidence shows it still exists with a lot of your memories and personality still intact. As far as other after death communications, sometimes they're spontaneous. They just occur. I mean, it's just I mentioned before, probably the most common form of after death communication are these dream visitations. A regular dream, I call them a regular dream. You've had them. We all have them. They're disjointed. They seem to make no sense. It's all over the place, and you forget them as soon as you wake up. But a visitation dream, which is where somebody from the next world visits you, um, you know, telepathically through your mind, they're very tactile. You could talk to them, you could hug them, you could kiss them, you can have a conversation, and you don't forget them when you wake up. So those are, very common. People report those to us every day. There are also cases where people have these visions of people um, that have died, but the person that has the vision doesn't know that they're dead. They think they're alive. So those can be very evidential, because you can't make the argument that somebody is making it up. They had no idea that the person had just died, and yet there's the person standing in front of them. So there are all sorts of, they call those crisis apparitions. There are all sorts of things like that occur that shouldn't, if you use the material explanation of the only thing that makes sense of things that we can perceive with our physical known senses. There's a lot of senses. We only perceive 1% of the universe, so there's a lot of things we don't know and we can't see.
No, that's the amazing part of life. And with these reports, I don't want to call them stories. Let's call them testimonies that people they tell you and your foundation. What are the commonalities of these stories of what they've seen? Are they seeing loved ones? Are they seeing a deity? Are they seeing creatures. Is there a common theme to these?
Well, there are a lot of, a lot of people talk about synchronicities. That's when events happen that are seemingly unrelated, and then they come together to form meaning. Some people, the theory is that the people in the next world are energy, the thought and energy, and they can affect physical matter, called psychokinesis, mind affecting matter. So just because they're no longer in the physical world, they still can affect things that happen here. So a lot of people talk about light, things happening with lights and electricity. Um, you mentioned the Netflix docuseries, Surviving Death. We gave Netflix a video that my wife shot when we walked into our kitchen. We were just talking about our deceased daughter, Bailey, and then we walk into the kitchen, and our kitchen had 9 hi-hats in it. And as I walk into the kitchen, all the hi-hats start. It's like a 4th of July light show, and it was just in the kitchen. There was no disruptions of electricity anyplace else in the house, and it lasted for about 5 minutes. It stopped, and then it went on for another 5 minutes. And me, I always have to rule out the physical explanation. So at 9 o'clock the next morning, I had an electrician in the house, and I made him take down each one of the 9 hi-hats and inspect them. And then they were fine. And then I had him take out all the light switches and examine them, and they were fine. So it hadn't happened in the 15 years that we had lived there before, and it didn't happen in the years after that. So those are things that I would consider to be a sign or an after-death communication of my daughter getting our attention, because we were also just talking about her, and that was like hello from the other side. So if people report things, that movement of objects, certain things that appear, finding certain things, or animals and so forth. It's not, when people talk about, for instance, their deceased loved one loved a particular type of a bird, and all of a sudden that bird appears. That doesn't, I'm not suggesting that their loved one came back as a bird, but they could, use their thought, to get the bird to come to you. That's how that stuff works. But this, signs take on many different forms. It's the same principle. With you haven't seen or talked to a friend in 20 years, and you're thinking about them. When you wake up in the morning, and an hour later the phone rings and it's that person. How does that stuff happen, right?
I mean, it's explainable and also unexplainable at the same time, because I've had
Yeah.
a few experiences like that as well. And if we can go back real quick to the whole with the Netflix docuseries, and in case I might have missed it as you were telling me the story, how did this relationship start? You said your wife sent them a video.
Well, what happened was Leslie Kane wrote the book Surviving Death. She's an investigative journalist, and who met with many, many different people. She knew that I was involved with mediums and evaluating the evidence, and she traveled around the world talking to mediums, and she would take transcripts, and then she would come to me to ask me to score the information to determine the accuracy of the medium. So I had a relationship with Leslie. Then Leslie became the consulting producer for the Netflix docuseries. So she contacted me, and I met with them because they wanted us to be part of the series. And frankly, over the years, we've been burned before on a lot of media projects, because people say the producers tell you they're going to do one thing, and it turns out to be a hatchet job. But we met with them in their office in Manhattan for 4.5 hours until we were comfortable that they were approaching it from an independent, fair viewpoint, and they did.
And that's one of the things that unfortunately we have to look out for when And I can understand, like, if I were to contact you, which I did, you would have to be like, what is this person about? Are they going to do a hatchet job, or are they a carny? So you really have to weed out what you think is going to be potentially shine a negative light to what it is that you're doing. And for the listeners of Let's Find Out, on that Netflix docuseries, what season and what episode are you featured in?
Well, there are 6 episodes, and we're in episode 4 for the last half of that. And I have to tell you, it's somewhat humorous because Netflix filmed us for 70 hours. 70.
Wow.
I mean, in our home, they wanted to go to the accident site where my kids were involved. We hold 4 grief retreats per year, and we let them film an entire grief retreat. So that's 70 hours of film resulted in maybe 25 to 30 minutes of content. Yes, so that's the nature, that's the nature of TV and movies and so forth, right?
Right. And you mentioned something that sounds pretty amazing, these grief retreats. How does Is there an application process to this before you let them come to these retreats?
Well, people they fill up very quickly because we limit them to around 50 people because we want it to be an intimate experience. And we hold one in Florida, one in California, and 2 in Connecticut. And we have certified mediums there. We have grief professionals. We have scientists. We have metaphysical practitioners. And we expose the attendees to all sorts of things. But the most heartwarming thing for us is that we see people when they arrive on Friday afternoon and they could barely speak. Sometimes their grief is so profound. And then Sunday night when they leave, there's a lightness that comes about. I mean, I'm not suggesting that we're curing anybody from grief. That's preposterous to say that. But if you can change the way that people think about death, and if they could come to know that their loved one still survives, it could make it easier, and then we've seen it happen time and time again.
And when are the next scheduled retreats for this year of 2024?
Well, our next scheduled one is in April in Connecticut, and one after that is in July, also in Connecticut. The problem is that they sell out very quickly, so they're both sold out. In about a month, we'll be announcing our California retreat in October. It's in the San Jose area, and then Florida will be in January. People, if they join the foundation, and it's free to join, we don't charge. It's foreverfamilyfoundation.org. We send you advance notice before registration gets open for these retreats because, we want our members to have first crack at it.
And one question I like to ask, and I was talking to my wife about this, and she said, be careful how you ask this question because sometimes people can take it the wrong way. So let's put aside what we grew up with religious wise or science, or either we're atheists or that other word that escapes my mind right now, but agnostic. In your opinion, from what you've researched so far, what are we to expect when that day eventually happens? Are we going to be surprised at what we see? Would it be different than what we've been taught?
Yeah, I think sometimes organized religion, paints certain pictures that may not be true. I mean, I prefer to think of myself as being a lot less religious now, but a lot more spiritual. To me, spirituality is religion without the rules, without the dogma. So when people have near-death experiences, what they talk about? They talk about they talk about a life review, and they see their whole life flash before their eyes, and they get to feel the good that they imparted to others. And that's a great feeling. But on the other hand, they also feel the hurt, either that they would, knowingly or unknowingly caused upon others, and that doesn't feel so good. So I think that what happens is that when we cross over, it's all about self-judgment. We go with other like-minded people where we belong. Personally, I don't believe that there's a deity that says you go here or you go there. That we go where we belong based upon the actions that we took in this physical world. I also believe that there's a continuous period of growth and enlightenment, when we get to the other side, that even people that were miserable human beings in this physical world have a much different perspective and are helped to grow, once they're free of this physical body and everything, the ego mind and everything that goes with it.
And I really love your answer and I appreciate what you said because I've asked several people that are similar in your field or had experiences. They pretty much told me almost the same thing you did.
Yeah, it's a common fundamental principle, I think, of spirituality. And I think that, I mean, it is a touchy subject, but I think, you know, all religions essentially are saying the same thing. It's all about love and compassion. Say it in different ways, but that's what it all comes down to, right? So and that's the same thing, with spirituality. You have to come to some sort of belief system. What do you believe? Do you believe that this life is chaotic and random, or do you think that it's part of a design? And if you think it's part of a design, what makes the most sense is that the things that we do here, the way we overcome obstacles, have an effect on us in the next life.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you said that being more spiritual, more compassionate, and I think that we come in a time where, and I guess things cycle and recycle all the time. Too. It seems that the less spiritual we're getting, the worse it gets for us.
Yeah, absolutely. We're in a kind of a critical era. I mean, when I talk to people that are in that work in the spirituality, a lot of them will say that we're getting closer. We're on the cusp of getting becoming a different species of what we were before. With more compassion, more love. You'll look around and turn on the news tomorrow, and it's hard to agree with them.
Right.
But I think ultimately, I think there's more positive energy in the world than negative energy, and essentially we're all creatures that have empathy towards one another. We get clouded by our ego mind and pressures and financial things and politics and greed and so forth. But essentially, if you peel us down to where we started, we do have empathy for one another. And you see that in tragedies that happen. Everybody comes out, regardless of your differences, to help one another, because that's who we are.
True, and when you break down humans, we're actually very compassionate. It's just that I guess we get so bombarded with what goes on because it makes the news, and I think they're just trying to get the ratings. I guess it affects us in a very negative way. And for the listeners of Let's Find Out that want to know more about what the work that you do and maybe want to attend one of your retreats, where can they find out more about not only your books but you're also Forever Family Foundation?
Well, the best way is it's the Forever Family Foundation, spelled out, .org. We're actually in the middle of undergoing a complete redesign of the website, but there's plenty of information there. I personally write a blog called BeyondTheFiveSenses.com, where I get my thoughts out about a lot of these subjects unrelated to the foundation. The two books are on Amazon. The Medium Explosion, which talks about the world of mediumship and how they operate, and what you should do when you go to a medium. The other book, My Life Here and There, has a twist to it, so it also involves the afterlife. Other than that, we do have a radio show that airs every Thursday. The link is on our website. We have five different formats of the show, and we talk about a lot of the things that we're talking about here with you, tonight, Diego.
No, and I really appreciate you coming on the show and how positive you've been. And I think that at first I was kind of hesitant about this conversation only because of this subject matter is very sensitive to some people. You're doing great things out there, and I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Well, thanks. I appreciate you.
Well, thank you, my friend. This has been another excellent episode of Let's Find Out with Diego. Please check us out on all our social media, YouTube, and we're also on Rumble. Like, share, and subscribe. Also, Let's Find Out is now on KGRA Digital Broadcasting. Catch the show on Saturdays at 2 a.m. For more information, please visit kgradb.com. Thank you for taking this journey with me. Until next time, my friends.
Copyright CoHostDiego. All content for Let's Find Out is the property of CoHostDiego and is served directly from our servers with no modification, redirects, or rehosting. All celebrity impersonators are paid performers. The impersonated celebrities do not endorse or promote any views or opinions expressed by our guests, CoHostDiego, or Let's Find Out. The information shared on Let's Find Out is provided on an as-is basis with no guarantees of completeness, accuracy, usefulness, or timeliness.